Hello, I'm John Stevens, and I want to welcome everyone to the Shaw Contract Listening Room. I can't tell you how excited I am today to welcome Liz Ogbu. Liz is a designer, an urbanist that leads Studio O. Liz, first of all, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure. I'm excited to be in conversation with you.
So it's been probably 12 years since when we first met, when you were working at public architecture in San Francisco, and almost a year since we last saw each other when you were speaking about spatial justice. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and how that defines your work?
Yeah, I thought it might be easiest if I just show a couple of slides because I think it's one of those things that helps for you to look at it while I explain it. Spatial justice is essentially, it basically means that justice has a geography and that the equitable distribution of access, services, and outcomes should be a basic human right. And it's often intersected with racial and social justice, because if you look at which communities lack spatial justice, it often falls along race and class lines. And so, for example, if you think about, you can pretty much go to any city in the country, and if you think about which neighborhoods wound up with the industrial uses and which ones got the gleaming office towers, and then looked at the populations of those neighborhoods, there would be some very clear differences. Similarly, if you looked at which neighborhoods wound up with a lot of vacant lots versus which ones get the really nice, pretty parks, again, often if you go to the populations, you can see some very clear differences. So I often work in low-income communities of color, looking at how do I use design to try to get us closer to a place where there is some spatial justice and where we're breaking down the divisions along race and class. And so just a quick example of one of my projects that I've been working on for a number of years in San Francisco. It's in the community of Bayview Hunters Point, which is this historic African-American working class neighborhood on the southeastern edge of San Francisco. And in many ways, it's the epitome of spatial injustice. So it has a disproportionate amount of the city's industrial uses and always has pretty much since its early days, including this power plant site, which is where I'm working. Another good illustration is pre-pandemic, the median home price in San Francisco was $1 million. And no, that's crazy. We can have a whole conversation about that. But the median income in this neighborhood was $63,000. So you can already see there's like quite a bit of disparities. So the community living on the hill above this plant, which is actually quite a few public housing, and it was a group of mothers that led the fight to close this plant in the late 90s. And so the utility company PG&E closed it down, they cleaned the soil, and then they capped the soil with asphalt until future development could happen. And the challenge is that that was 30 acres of asphalt. And at the time when this was completed, which was in the late aughts, there was a sense that it was going to be about a decade before redevelopment can happen. Right now, we are sitting at a decade, and it's probably going to be more like 2. So imagine having 30 acres of asphalt right in your backyard. And the utility company very quickly realized that this was untenable. And so they put out a call for design teams to propose interim uses for the site. So I'm part of a team that won that commission. And so, pre-pandemic, we'd spent years programming the site in collaboration with the community and with community organizations. So doing everything from job training workshops to there was an annual backpack festival with lots of cute kids, and even an annual circus. We had over 25,000 people come to the site. And for me, spatial justice is not just in terms of taking these sites and offering opportunities that start to address some of the access issues, but also making sure that the process by which we do design is different and that we use design to have certain conversations. So for me, these were essentially almost like our community meetings in terms of bringing people together for conversations of what they wanted to see about the future. And we also tried to have other ways in which we were listening and hearing what people were feeling. So in the early days of the project, we actually built a listening booth on our site out of a shipping container and partnered with StoryCorps to do recordings. We also partnered in 2019 with a local artist who has this nationally recognized project called Question Bridge. And we did Question Bridge Bayview, which focused in particular on issues of race, identity, and space, and trying to use our site to have important conversations about the neighborhood. And, because I know we probably have some architects and designers, it was like, well, what does that mean to built form? Most of the site will not be developed until the agreement is reached. But there was one piece that hadn't been remediated yet. It was the shoreline edge. So we worked with the utility company to make sure that when it was remediated, it wasn't restored to basic level, but it was restored to a higher level and could essentially become a linear park. And all of the input of what this should be came through those events that I showed earlier. We used it as a way to show people the designs, to talk through ideas for the design. And a lot of what you see here is emanated from that. And one of the things that we heard, and I think this is really important when we talk about justice, is how do the stories of struggle not get lost, and how do you always know who is there? So we have a lot of interpretive signage. This one tells the story of the struggle to tear down the plant. And there are quotes all throughout that actually came from the StoryCorps recordings. And so it's an idea of having these voices embedded in this beautiful landscape. So that's a quick snapshot of spatial justice.
No, that's fantastic. How did you, in the conversation, motivate the energy company to do that work?
I will say, to their credit, they kind of recognized that keeping 30 acres of asphalt was not going to work. So I actually think it's an important thing that they put out this call. And what was interesting is that my colleagues at Envelope A+D and RHAA, which is a landscape company here in the Bay Area, we really talked about, well, what would it take for us to do this project? And we really said we didn't want to be a shill and kind of just do like the cool shipping container projects, right? Like, which was what sort of interim use had a reputation for being at the time that we started. And so we went in and we sort of said, we only want to do this if it's about completely revamping the way in which we engage with the community. And they fought for this land, so their voices should determine what we do. And we were also like, from a practical standpoint, it doesn't make sense to do a shipping container with boutique businesses here. Like, it's not going to economically work or serve this population.
Yeah.
And so we kind of were expecting we would not get hired, but apparently it was a unanimous decision. And I think, one of the things I've recognized in my work is like, everybody really desires to be on the right side. They want to do right by the people who are served or impacted by what they do. And oftentimes they lack an entryway in which to do that. What we discovered is like, some of it is sort of helping them understand how through their job they can do right by this community. Some of it was about an actual act of translations. I often joke at how, because they're a utility company, they understand what they do is providing energy. What we are doing in terms of community development is just like whoosh. In talking to our counterparts and finding out what success meant to them, normal practice is to maintain the site and keep it safe while it is not being used. So that's getting a security company, that's making sure there are not calls to the mayor about like what's happening on the site. We basically started saying, well, we're just doing a new form of site management. Like, instead of having to have like massive amounts of security, because we've created a community ownership over this site and the stewardship, the community is kind of taking care of the site. And instead of getting angry calls to the mayor about vandalism or what's happening to the site, you're getting calls of like, I loved that I was able to take my kid to the circus. We were like, it's probably cheaper than the way you normally do, and you're actually creating the seeds of allowing whatever the future needs to be. And then I would say the final ingredient to what we did is also breaking down things into small pieces. So like, when we first pitched doing the circus, I thought the client rep was going to fall out due to a heart attack. They were like, you want to do a what? And we were like, thinking it's a great idea. Circus will bring lots of people. They need a home. We've got lots of space. What we realized is we had to break it into bite-sized pieces. We were like, look, let's just try this. We'll dot the I's, cross the T's, sign all the agreements you need. And if it doesn't work, then we know that and we never do it again. It's one day. Let's just try it. And so when we did it, we got over 1,000 people, which was more than you normally see for any event in this neighborhood. And the client reps had come and they were seeing like children laughing, lots of different races congregating. They were like this throughout the entire time and they were feeling the energy. And so, you know, a few months later when we were like, we have another great idea, can we do a petting zoo? Because that was something that people had asked for. They didn't bat an eye. They were like, just make sure they sign the agreements. And so it was like giving them a little, you know, I sort of say like, how do you de-risk failure? Try this thing. If it doesn't work, then we learn from it. And whenever we had things that failed, we always made sure to document and understand why. Then we would present that back and sort of say, so this is how we're going to fix that next time.
If you were to talk about, you know, how they can translate their intent to have an impact in spatial justice, what could that look like? What are some of the things that you know we can do as either someone who makes things or designs things to have that level of impact?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are a couple of things. So one, I would say that, you know, as architects and designers, when clients come to us, they sort of trust us to have a certain expertise, right? Like that's why they're hiring you. And so they trust that we know a process that's going to get them to where they want to go. And I think we've almost fallen into like this pattern of like, you know, I imagine just thinking about the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, and they have a standard contract, right? And they have a thing that says these are the particular phases. And I feel like oftentimes the profession gets into this rut where we just follow the phases and we do this set bit of things. And it's sort of like, no, actually you can, yes, you know, contractually there's those things, but you can weave in and describe the process any which way you want. And so, you know, in a lot of my projects, what you'll see is there's a lot of time spent talking to community members, not early on, but also all throughout the project. If I were to follow a traditional contractual relationship, the way I was taught that like a project goes, maybe there'd be a few community meetings early on, but that's about it. And so it's more sort of saying, I know to get to where we all want to go to, we've got to revamp this process and actually create space to engage with community members more throughout. You can define those terms. I think the other thing that is really important is when I say client, I actually often mean two types of clients. There's a traditional client that we know of, who's the person who pays us. But I actually think there's a second more important client that our processes generally do not include, and that is the people who have to live with the impact of whatever we've created. Our process has very little space for them. And I actually think it's incumbent on us to figure out how to bring them more into the process. And so at the beginning of every project, I sort of ask who's going to be most impacted or who's going to be impacted and they're not included in the list of people that we are talking to or who are determining the scope of this project. So, you know, I sometimes get asked from people that, well, you know, I can see you're working in low-income communities of color. I can see like how you're doing like socially relevant work there. But if you're doing an office tower, have you ever talked to the janitor? Like the person who actually has to clean up that building, who's like operating in the dark and in the hidden spaces, they're like completely invisible to our processes, yet they're completely impacted by what you do to the building or the security guard. Or if you're doing a home, is there, you know, thinking about people who can be privileged enough to have an architect design their home, whether it's the housekeeper or some of the gardeners coming to the lawn, or even just the kids who have to live in a house. Do we talk to them? I think it's taking that moment in the beginning to ask if we were going to really create not just a good project, but a right project, who would we need to include? Whose voices are not part of how we're understanding what it is that we need to do?
If you're having new conversations or having to connect with people, What's changed and what lessons have you learned in the last year, how you still facilitate effective dialogues?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. My work is occurring in low-income communities of color. If you think about the sort of twin pandemics of COVID and racism, these are the communities that are sort of more, I would say that some of the work has just been about understanding what do you really need right now just to survive. We were not going to do a season of programming this year, but we had the money and we had the resources. And I think that's really an important thing of what I try to do is understand that like, I have a certain amount of power and privilege, and part of my job is to funnel it. Our team came together and we actually lobbied the utility company to use our funds and use our time to actually do rapid response work. So we reached out to folks in the community and said, look, we've got this budget. we are happy to allocate it. What is the critical need? We heard food insecurity was the biggest need. So we formed a partnership with the San Francisco. We're on hiatus right now, but for most of this year, we've been providing, or most of 2020, starting from the pandemic, 300 to 350 bags of food weekly, and whatever else we could hustle. So I found a lead on masks. We got that to people, got art kits for kids. So, it may seem like that's a weird thing for a designer to be engaged in, but it's sort of like I recognize that the space we've created, its ultimate mission is to serve the community. And so my role needs to be whatever I can do to help make that happen. But then on another level, there's still projects that are moving forward. And so the question has become like, let us not use the sort of digital divide or the fact that we can't congregate people in meetings to be an excuse to not do these processes the right way. So I would probably say that there's been a lot of extra time spent trying to figure out how to do community meetings online, how to reach out to people and make sure that they're still part of the conversation or that they're at least knowing what's going forward. And then the final thing that's been happening in this time is one of my projects, which is in Charlottesville, and we're working on it before the racist insurrection in 2017, but that sort of gave renewed emphasis on it. And so it's a redevelopment of a Section 8 housing property. And for almost 2 years, we've been talking about how to shift it to be like a model for anti-racist housing. And our struggle had been like, where are we going to get the money to do that? Because, the funding cycles, it was a little bit outside of where they thought. And then, the events of the last year happened. And not only do we think it opened up a space to be able to fund more of that work, but it also made us figure out, like, let's double down. If we're really going to create a model for anti-racist housing, what does that mean? And so there's been a lot of amazing conversations over the last couple of months with the residents about, like, let's walk through what is this and what do we need to put together to make it a reality.
No, that's fantastic. I mean, there's, certainly, have you seen a shift in maybe even intensity of dialogue or people asking different questions and leading to different decisions that organizations are making, whether it's, within a specific company that you've had contact or worked with, or in communities that are asking different questions? Have you seen a shift in that conversation in the last year?
Yes and no. So I would say the no is more to just sort of say that because of the particular communities that I'm often working in, this conversation was always kind of top of mind. I think in like the Charlottesville example illustrates what perhaps has shifted. The fact that we're having the conversation hasn't shifted. The depth with which we could have the conversation, the resources that are available to support the manifestation of elements of the conversation, that part has shifted. But then there are other clients for whom, this is like definitely opened up a new space. So I have one client that's a for-profit property owner and happens to own a lot of like affordable units. And we were already doing some really great work. But after the murder of George Floyd, the client wanted to put out a statement, and our team, we talked about it and we said, well, if we're going to put out a statement in the land of many, many statements, people don't need our tears, right? They don't need additional words saying or expressing the sympathies. What they need is action, something that actually moves the needle on justice. And so when the statement came out, it actually included a kind of 5 points at which we were committing to spend time figuring out, well, what would it take to shift that to an anti-racist frame? And so, the client, to their credit, has continued to make good on that. So we brought in a trainer, but then we actually had assigned roles of who was responsible for each of those 5 points, and actually said, you're responsible for like building out, analyzing what are the ways in which we're being complicit with harm in this area of work, and what's a strategy that we can do to shift it to be more anti-racist. And so, it's definitely not easy work, and I definitely think it's kind of emotionally confronting, and it's not fast either. But I think it would have been hard to have the conversation of how do we use this as a frame for what we're doing prior to the events of this spring and summer. But I talk a lot about like how we seem locked in a time of urgency right now, but I think there are 2 different types of urgency. There's like the urgency that is about repair, which is actually one that leads into a longer state of like active repairing. And then there's one that's actually about forgetting, because we're really uncomfortable with what has been made visible, and we really just want to do enough to get past having to look at it. And so my concern with the moment is like, how do we do the repair instead of the forgetting piece? Because if we shift back into a normal that's like slightly better, the truth of the matter is normal did not work for most people. Yeah. And so I recognize it's harder to stay into this active zone of like, repair is going to take decades, but we had a couple 100 years that contributed to the state that we see now. And I would say, even as a profession in terms of architecture and design, I think in many ways we've just been really kind of complicit with the harm. We've done a little bit to tweak, but we haven't radically changed the way in which our spaces are harmful to a whole lot of people. So I really hope that this is also taken as a call for the profession to figure out how to not just do a little better, but like really be a participant in a long-term conversation of racial and spatial justice.
No, I know certainly even in our organization, as we were wrestling that, we came out with an action plan. Here's 3 things that we're working on to have systemic long-term impact on on us and our communities and the people we engage with. And it wasn't statements don't really have impact. It's the work.
Yes.
And that it's been really kind of, just internally, it's been cool to see that kind of engagement throughout our organization. So, hey, one article that I read recently that you wrote was really interesting to me, was about the sense of grounding and being grounded. Talk about what's grounding you right now.
Also another good question. I think it's a couple of different things. I do think the communities that I'm working in, like, just, they are an amazing teacher in a way, because the uncertainty that, like, in that article, I talk about like how when lockdown hit, it felt uncertain to so many people, but there were also other people for whom, like, they were used to battling food insecurity, or that each day was like kind of a struggle to balance work, to balance your family, to balance like under your health. And so, like, many of the residents living in the communities I work in, that's their reality. And so I'm looking at them both to learn, but then also to say, like, how do we eliminate this from being anyone else's reality, and using that as a way to also think about, like, how do we dream bigger? So those things. And then just like, general self-care, like meditation. But so, we can have a whole call on that one.
So I know we are right against being out of time, but so one last question I have is there work today that you're seeing for other people in the practice and architects and design who are work that you're seeing that's inspiring you, that you feel like is something besides, by the way, all of your TED Talks and the work that you're doing? I encourage everyone to view, and you will be inspired for sure, and go to Liz's website and read more about her work, which will again, I think be provocative and inspiring to all of us. But is there work out there that's being done right now that's inspiring you?
Yeah, there's a couple of different things. So also in Oakland, and also a woman who did a TED Talk in the same one that I did, Deanna Van Buren, runs an amazing practice called Designing Justice, Designing Spaces. And they have been in particular focused on excuse me, issues of restorative justice aimed at the carceral state. So building alternatives to prison. In other words, not building a new type of prison, but building the like actual, and so they've got amazing projects that are also about like repurposing old jails in ways that like seed them in moving away from the harm into a place of healing. They're doing like the Detroit Justice Center, which is this amazing collaboration between multiple groups. I also think design as protests, which Brian Lee of Colocate has been leading, which really talks about like, how do we think about design as like engaging more of these issues, not clinging to a false neutrality, but like really kind of saying, what does it mean to speak out on these issues? I also think Sue Mobley, who used to partner with Brian around paper monuments in New Orleans, which was like reconstructing new monuments that honor things that have been invisible. And she's now taken that work to Monument Lab, which is doing some incredible work about like thinking about these places that we have monumentalized and like, how do we create new ways of honoring history? And then the final one I'll mention is Antoinette Carroll and the Creative Reaction Design Lab out of St. Louis. Not only are they doing incredible work in the city about rethinking what design is, in particular aimed at BIPOC youth, but they actually have been doing a number of workshops that are looking at things like white supremacy in design. And so, if you're trying to figure out how to getting additional skills and how to do this work, I would totally check out their website. Center for Urban Pedagogy also has been doing a similar thing. And so both of those are great if you're looking for, how do I just understand these terms? How do I think about what it means in the context of design? I would point you to both of those organizations as places to go.
Fantastic. Well, first of all, Liz, thank you so much for joining us in the listening room, and thanks for all of you for tuning in. So thank you. And again, look forward to seeing all of you again in the listening room.